The morning sun painted the Montana mountains in shades of gold and orange. John Morrison sat on his wooden porch with a cup of coffee growing cold in his hands. He watched the mist rise from the valley below and listened to the birds singing in the pine trees. At 73 years old, he had learned to appreciate these quiet moments. They were gifts that younger men often ignored. His cabin was simple: 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, a living room with a stone fireplace. His wife Margaret had chosen this place 40 years ago when they were young and full of dreams. She said the mountains reminded her of peace. She said a person could think clearly here, away from the noise of the world. She had been right about most things. Margaret had been gone for 3 years now. Cancer took her slowly, giving them time to say everything that needed saying. In her final weeks, she made him promise to finish something they had started together long ago. He promised. He always kept his promises to her. John finished his coffee and walked inside to wash the cup. His movements were slow but steady. His body had aged, but his mind remained sharp. 40 years of tracking shipments, managing schedules, and solving logistical problems had trained him to notice details that others missed. Even now, retired and living alone, he kept records of everything. It was a habit he could not break. Margaret had taught him that habit. The sound of engines broke the morning silence. John dried his hands and walked back to the porch. 3 black vehicles were climbing the dirt road toward his cabin. Government vehicles. He recognized the style from his years working with Earth's interstellar trading company. These were official cars, the kind that brought news nobody wanted to hear. He waited patiently as the vehicles parked in front of his cabin. 6 men and women in formal suits stepped out. One of them, a tall woman with gray hair and tired eyes, walked up to the porch steps. "Mr. Morrison?" she asked. "That's me. I'm Director Chen from the Department of Galactic Affairs. May we come inside?" John nodded and led them into his living room. There were not enough chairs for everyone, so most of them stood. Director Chen sat across from John and placed a tablet on the coffee table between them. "Mr. Morrison, I'm going to be direct with you. The Galactic Council has issued a summons for your appearance before the Grand Tribunal on Velthar Prime." John said nothing. He waited for her to continue. "You're being charged with species-level economic manipulation. The specific claim is that your retirement pension fund holds shares in a mining consortium that violated Trade Regulation 749 Alpha approximately 300 years ago. Under council law, this makes you personally liable for enforcement penalties." "I see," John said. Director Chen leaned forward. "Mr. Morrison, you need to understand what this really is. The charges are absurd. The regulation they're citing is ancient and has never been enforced against any human entity. The Velthari are manufacturing a legal pretext to seize Earth's off-world assets. If you're found guilty, the penalties would legally justify taking everything we've built in space over the past 60 years. "Why me?" "Because you're nobody. I'm sorry to put it that way, but that's the truth. You're a retired logistics coordinator with no connections, no resources, and no way to fight back. They expect you to fold immediately. They expect you to accept whatever terms they dictate just to make the nightmare end. They chose you because they think you're weak." John looked at the tablet on the table. The screen showed his official summons, written in the formal language of galactic law. His name appeared at the top in bold letters. John Morrison of Earth, defendant. "What are my options?" Director Chen exchanged glances with her colleagues. "Earth government is prepared to intervene diplomatically. We can send lawyers, negotiators, representatives with experience in council proceedings. We can try to delay, obstruct, and eventually negotiate a settlement that limits the damage. And if I represent myself, that would be suicide, Mr. Morrison. The council's legal system is designed to crush people like you. They have 17 prosecutors assigned to your case. Some of them have spent centuries studying galactic law. You're a logistics coordinator. You wouldn't last 5 minutes." John stood and walked to the window. He looked out at the mountains his wife had loved so much. The mist had cleared now, and the peaks stood sharp against the blue sky. "When do I need to leave?" "The enforcement vessel arrives in orbit tomorrow morning. You'll be transported directly to Velthar Prime. The tribunal begins in 3 days." "That's not much time." "No, it's not." John turned back to face Director Chen. "I'll represent myself." The room went silent. Director Chen stared at him as if he had spoken in a foreign language. Mr. Morrison, did you hear what I just said? They will destroy you. They will use you to destroy all of us. This isn't a courtroom where truth and justice matter. This is a political arena where the powerful crush the weak. You don't have the training, the knowledge, or the resources to survive what's coming. Maybe not, John said, but I have something else. What could you possibly have? John walked to a closet near the fireplace. He opened it and reached inside, pulling out an old leather folder. The leather was worn and cracked, the color faded from decades of handling. He held it gently, the way a person holds something precious. My wife gave me this folder on our wedding day. She told me to keep records of everything I saw, every transaction, every shipment, every document that crossed my desk. She said someday the truth would matter. She spent her whole career teaching history, and she understood something that most people forget. Power depends on secrets. When secrets become public, power changes hands. Director Chen stood. Mr. Morrison, with all respect, a folder full of old documents won't help you against the Galactic Council. We'll see. The next morning, John's children arrived at the cabin. His son David drove up from Helena with his wife and 2 children. His daughter Sarah flew in from Seattle with her husband. They gathered in the living room where John had met with Director Chen, and they begged him to reconsider. Dad, please, Sarah said, her eyes red from crying. Let the government handle this. Let the lawyers fight for you. I appreciate your concern, sweetheart, but this is something I need to do myself. Why? Why does it have to be you? John looked at his grandchildren, 2 boys aged 8 and 10, who sat quietly on the couch, not fully understanding what was happening, but sensing its importance. Your grandmother spent her whole life studying how civilizations rise and fall. She taught me that the moments when history changes don't usually look dramatic when they're happening. They look like ordinary people making ordinary choices. Someone decides to speak when everyone else stays silent. Someone writes down what they see instead of looking away. Someone stands up when everyone tells them to sit down. He placed his hand on the leather folder resting on the table beside him. Margaret believed that I would face a moment like this someday. She prepared me for it. She made me promise to be ready. I'm not going to break that promise now. David shook his head. Dad, Mom's been gone for 3 years. You don't owe her anything anymore. You don't have to sacrifice yourself for some promise made a long time ago. That's where you're wrong, son. The promises we make to the people we love don't expire when they die. If anything, those promises become more important. They become sacred. The enforcement vessel arrived exactly when Director Chen said it would. A Velthari shuttle descended through the morning clouds and landed in the meadow beside John's cabin. The ship was sleek and silver, designed to project power and authority. 2 council officers in formal uniforms walked down the ramp and approached the cabin. John's family stood on the porch, watching. Sarah held her father's hand, not wanting to let go. The boys stood close to their mother, confused and scared. John hugged each of them in turn. He told David to take care of the cabin while he was away. He told Sarah to be strong and to remember what her mother always said about truth and patience. He knelt down and looked his grandsons in the eyes. I want you boys to remember something. The people who seem weak are often the strongest. The ones who look like they have no power are sometimes the most dangerous. Your grandmother taught me that. Now I'm teaching you. He stood and picked up his leather folder. He had packed nothing else. No extra clothes, no provisions, no technology, just the folder and the documents inside it. The council officers watched him approach with expressions of barely concealed contempt. To them, he was already defeated. An old human with nothing but a worn leather folder, walking willingly to his own destruction. I'm John Morrison, he said. I understand you're here to take me to Velthar Prime. That is correct, one officer said. You will come with us now. John nodded and walked up the ramp into the shuttle. He did not look back. Looking back was for people who doubted their choices. John Morrison had no doubts. Inside the shuttle, he found a small passenger compartment with seats designed for species much larger than humans. He sat down, placed the folder on his lap, and waited. The engines hummed to life, and the shuttle lifted off, carrying him away from everything he knew. Once the ship entered hyperspace, the journey would take 2 days. John had nothing to do but wait and prepare. He opened the leather folder and began reviewing the documents inside. There were thousands of pages organized by year and category: charts, records, transaction logs, regulatory filings, correspondence, and analysis. 40 years of careful observation, all documented in precise detail. The council officers ignored him. They sat in their own section of the shuttle, speaking in their own language, probably discussing what would happen when they arrived. They had no reason to pay attention to an old man reading old papers. John smiled to himself and continued reviewing. Everything was in order. Everything was exactly where it needed to be. When he finished reviewing, he closed the folder and closed his eyes. Within minutes, he was asleep. His breathing was slow and peaceful. His face showed no worry, no fear, no concern of any kind. The officers noticed this and exchanged confused looks. Every other defendant they had transported spent the journey in terror, crying, pleading, trying to negotiate. This human slept as if he were going on vacation. They did not understand. They could not understand. To them, John Morrison was just an old man with no power and no chance. They had no idea what was coming. No one did. The Grand Tribunal Hall on Velthar Prime was built to inspire fear. It rose from the capital city like a mountain of polished black stone, its towers reaching toward the purple sky. Inside, thousands of seats curved around a central platform where the accused would stand. Every detail of the architecture was designed to make anyone standing in that center feel small and alone. John Morrison walked into the hall wearing the same simple clothes he had worn when he left Montana. Gray trousers, a white shirt, a brown jacket that Margaret had bought for him 15 years ago. He carried his leather folder under his arm. He had no assistants, no lawyers, no supporters walking beside him. The galleries were already filling with delegates from across the galaxy. Representatives of hundreds of species took their seats, talking among themselves in dozens of languages. Many of them had traveled great distances to watch this trial. Word had spread that the Galactic Council was finally going to teach humanity a lesson. Many wanted to see it happen. John found his place on the defendant's platform. A single chair had been provided for him, positioned so that he would have to look up at the judges and across at the prosecution team. He sat down, placed his folder on the small table beside him, and waited. The prosecution section was directly opposite. 17 Velthari legal specialists sat in an orderly row, each one wearing the formal robes of their profession. Their leader, High Arbiter Kesseth, stood at the front. He was tall even by Velthari standards, with scaled skin that shimmered blue and gold under the lights. His eyes were cold and confident. He had never lost a case in 200 years of practice. The judges entered from a door behind the highest platform. 5 of them, each from a different species loyal to council interests. They wore ceremonial headdresses that marked their authority. The chief judge, an ancient being called Magistrate Voren, raised one hand for silence. The hall fell quiet immediately. "This tribunal is now in session," Voren announced. His voice was amplified throughout the hall. "The matter before us is the case of the Galactic Council versus John Morrison of Earth. The defendant is charged with species-level economic manipulation under Trade Regulation 749 Alpha. High Arbiter Kesseth, you may present the prosecution's case." Kesseth rose from his seat and walked to the center of the platform. He moved with the easy confidence of someone who knew he had already won. "Honored judges, distinguished delegates, this case is simple. The human species has been a minor member of this council for 60 years. In that time, they have slowly accumulated economic influence beyond their station. They have exploited loopholes, manipulated markets, and violated regulations that exist to maintain order and stability across the galaxy." He gestured toward John with obvious contempt. "The defendant, John Morrison, is a symbol of human greed. Through his pension fund, he holds shares in a mining consortium that violated Trade Regulation 749 Alpha. This regulation, established over 300 years ago, prohibits certain types of cross-sector resource speculation. The violation is documented. The evidence is clear. The penalty under council law is the seizure of all associated assets and the payment of compensatory damages." Kesseth paused for effect. The delegates in the galleries murmured among themselves. Many of them nodded in agreement. I ask this tribunal to find John Morrison guilty and to authorize full enforcement of the prescribed penalties. Let this judgment serve as a reminder that no species, no matter how clever they believe themselves to be, can circumvent the laws that govern our civilization. He returned to his seat, and his team of specialists nodded their approval. The case was clear. The outcome was certain. This would be over quickly. Magistrate Voren turned his attention to John. The defendant may now respond to the charges. John stood slowly. He did not approach the center platform. He simply stood beside his small table with his leather folder in his hands. Thank you, Magistrate. I have a question before I respond. Voren's expression showed mild surprise. Defendants rarely ask questions. They usually begged for mercy or made desperate arguments that no one took seriously. You may ask your question, does this tribunal operate under Precedent Protocol 7? The hall went silent. Kessoff sat up straighter in his seat, his cold eyes suddenly alert. Clarify your question, Voren said. Precedent Protocol 7 states that any legal interpretation applied to one species must be applied equally to all species under identical circumstances. This is foundational law. It ensures that the Council's justice system treats everyone fairly, regardless of their size, power, or influence. I want to confirm that this protocol applies to my case. Voren consulted briefly with the other judges. They nodded in agreement. Yes, Precedent Protocol 7 applies to all tribunal proceedings. It is indeed foundational law. Thank you, John said. In that case, I will present my response to the charges. He opened his leather folder and removed a single document from the top of the stack inside. He held it up for the judges to see. This is a transaction record from 40 years ago. It documents a shipment of rare minerals from the Tassari system to the Velthari homeworld. The transaction was processed through a trading house called Velcor Industries, which is owned by High Arbiter Kessoff's family. The murmur in the galleries grew louder. Kessoff's expression hardened. This transaction violated Trade Regulation 749 Alpha in exactly the same way that my pension fund supposedly violated it. The same regulation, the same type of cross-sector resource speculation, the same technical breach. John placed the document on his table and removed another one from his folder. This is a similar transaction from 38 years ago. This one involves the Brennan Consortium, which is connected to Judge Voren's homeworld. Again, the same regulation violated in the same way. Voren shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The other judges exchanged concerned glances. John continued removing documents from his folder, one after another, placing them in a growing stack on his table. I spent 40 years working in logistics for Earth's interstellar trading company. My job was to track shipments, manage schedules, and solve problems. My wife, Margaret, was a history teacher who specialized in studying how powerful institutions maintain control over smaller ones. Together, we noticed something interesting. The regulations that the Council uses to punish minor species are never applied to Council members themselves. He held up another document. This is a record of enforcement actions taken under Trade Regulation 749 Alpha over the past 300 years. The regulation has been used 64 times. Every single time, the target was a minor species. Never once was it applied to a Council member species, despite thousands of documented violations by those species. Kessoff stood abruptly. Objection. The defendant is making irrelevant arguments. His pension fund violated the regulation. That is the only matter before this tribunal. John turned to face him. High Arbiter, I am not making arguments. I am presenting evidence, and I have not yet explained why this evidence is relevant. He looked back at the judges. Under Precedent Protocol 7, if you find me guilty of violating this regulation, you must also find guilty everyone else who violated it in the same way. That is what the protocol requires. Equal application of law. If you enforce this regulation against me, you must enforce it against the 4,217 other violations I have documented in this folder. The hall erupted in noise. Delegates shouted questions and objections. The judges called for order. Kessoff stood frozen, his confident expression replaced by something that looked very much like fear. John waited patiently for the noise to subside. When it finally did, he continued, I have documents covering every year of my 40-year career. Each document is verified. Each violation is recorded with dates, parties involved, transaction amounts, and regulatory citations. I am prepared to present all of them to this tribunal. Magistrate Voren leaned forward. Mr. Morrison, are you suggesting that you have evidence of thousands of regulatory violations by council member species? I am not suggesting it, Magistrate. I am stating it as fact, and I am requesting that this evidence be entered into the tribunal record under standard discovery procedures. One of the other judges, a thin being with 4 arms named Arbiter Thesson, spoke up. Discovery procedures require verification of submitted documents. This process could take weeks or months. I understand, John said. I have time. I am retired. The gallery delegates began talking loudly among themselves. This was not how the trial was supposed to go. This old human was supposed to beg for mercy, accept his guilt, and allow the council to claim their victory. Instead, he was turning the entire proceeding into something unexpected. Kessoth approached the judge's platform. I request an immediate recess. The prosecution needs time to review the defendant's claims. John spoke before the judges could respond. The prosecution has no right to review my evidence before I present it. Under tribunal rules, evidence submitted by defendants is entered into the record first and challenged afterward. I know these rules, High Arbiter. I memorize them. Kessoth turned to face John. For the first time, his cold confidence showed cracks. You are playing a dangerous game, human. I am not playing any game, John said calmly. I am following your rules. I am using your procedures. I am presenting evidence in a legal proceeding exactly as your laws permit. If this feels dangerous to you, perhaps you should ask yourself why. The judges conferred among themselves in whispered voices. After several minutes, Magistrate Voren raised his hand for silence. This tribunal will recess for 2 hours to consider procedural matters. When we reconvene, the defendant will be permitted to begin presenting his evidence. The prosecution may challenge each document as it is submitted. He struck a ceremonial gong, and the session ended. The delegates filed out of the hall, buzzing with conversation about what they had witnessed. John remained at his table, calmly organizing his documents. He was in no hurry. He had prepared for this moment for decades. Kessoth approached him as the hall emptied. The High Arbiter's scales had darkened, a sign of stress in his species. Morrison, I want to speak with you privately. Of course. They stepped into a small chamber beside the main hall. Kessoth closed the door behind them. I will make you an offer, Kessoth said. All charges dropped. You return to Earth immediately. You destroy your documents and never speak of this again. In exchange, you live out your remaining years in peace. John considered the offer. And Earth's assets? Remain untouched. We forget this ever happened. It was a generous offer. More generous than John had expected. It proved that Kessoth understood the danger he was facing. I appreciate the offer, High Arbiter, but I must decline. Kessoth's eyes narrowed. Why? You have won. You have embarrassed the council. You have proven your point. Why continue? John looked at the leather folder in his hands. He ran his fingers across the worn surface. 40 years ago, I watched council ships blockade a colony of human refugees. 800 people, including children, starving because they could not afford your tariffs. The council could have helped them. Instead, you let them die to make an example. I wrote down what happened. I wrote down who was responsible. He met Kessoth's eyes. I am not here to embarrass the council or prove a point. I am here because you invited me. Everything that happens next is your choice, not mine. You can drop the charges and let me go home, or you can continue this trial and face whatever comes. But I will not hide the truth to make your lives easier. Kessoth stared at him for a long moment. Then he turned and walked out of the chamber without another word. John returned to the main hall and sat down to wait. The recess would end soon, and there was much more evidence to present. He thought about Margaret and the promise he had made to her. He thought about the 800 refugees who had died while the galaxy looked away. 2 hours passed quickly. The delegates returned to their seats. The judges took their positions. The tribunal resumed, and John Morrison began presenting the first of 4,217 documented violations, one by one, in the calm and patient voice of a man who had waited his entire life for this moment. No one in the gallery understood what they were witnessing. No one realized that the old human in simple clothes was not defending himself. He was putting the entire Galactic Council on trial. They would understand soon enough. The tribunal continued for 7 days. Each morning, John Morrison arrived at the Grand Tribunal Hall in his simple clothes, carrying his leather folder. Each morning, the galleries were more crowded than the day before. Word had spread across the galaxy about what was happening on Velthar Prime. Ships arrived from distant systems carrying observers who wanted to witness history being made. By the 4th day, John had presented evidence covering only the first 8 years of his career. He worked methodically, presenting each document clearly and simply. He explained what each transaction showed, which regulation it violated, and which council member species were involved. The prosecution objected constantly, but John knew the procedural rules better than they did. Every objection was overruled. The Velthari trading houses were the most frequent violators. John had documented over 600 instances where Velthari companies broke the exact same regulation he was charged with violating. Each document was verified by independent experts brought in by the tribunal. Each violation was undeniable, but the Velthari were not alone. John's evidence implicated trading houses from dozens of council member species: the Brunari, the Cassorians, the Valthan, the Thessan Collective. Every major power in the galaxy had violated this regulation repeatedly, and none of them had ever been punished. On the 5th day, something unexpected happened. A delegation from the Thessari arrived at the tribunal hall. The Thessari were a minor species, much like humanity. They had suffered under council exploitation for centuries. Their resources taken, their voices ignored, their complaints dismissed. They had no power and no influence, but they had a right to observe tribunal proceedings. This right was guaranteed by council law, and no one could deny them entry. The Thessari delegation sat in the upper galleries and watched John present his evidence. Their leader, an elderly female named Counselor Marin, listened with growing emotion. She had spent her entire career fighting for justice within a system designed to deny it. She had never won. She had never even come close. Now she watched an old human doing what she had always dreamed of doing. He was exposing the truth in a forum where it could not be hidden or ignored. On the 6th day, Counselor Marin requested permission to address the tribunal. This was unusual but not unprecedented. Observers could petition to speak on matters of galactic importance. The judges had no legal grounds to refuse her. She walked to the center platform and faced the assembled delegates. Her voice was soft but steady. "I have watched this trial for 6 days. I have seen evidence of systematic corruption that confirms what minor species have suspected for generations. The laws of this council are not applied equally. They are weapons used by the powerful against the weak." She turned to face John Morrison. "This human has done what none of us could do. He has documented the truth. He has presented it in a way that cannot be denied or dismissed. He has shown the galaxy what the council really is." Then she said the words that changed everything. "Under the transparency mandate of the Galactic Charter, I formally request that all evidence presented by John Morrison be entered into the permanent galactic record. This evidence documents matters of public concern affecting multiple species. It must be preserved and made accessible to all citizens of the galaxy." The hall erupted in chaos. Delegates shouted in protest and support. The judges called for order. Kessa stood at the prosecution table, his scales darkening to almost black. The transparency mandate was an ancient provision that had almost never been used. It allowed any delegate to request that evidence in a tribunal proceeding be made permanently public if that evidence concerned matters affecting multiple species. The request could only be denied by a 2/3 majority vote of all delegates present. Magistrate Varen struck his ceremonial gong repeatedly until the hall finally quieted. His face showed deep concern as he consulted with the other judges. "Counselor Marin has invoked the transparency mandate. This request must be voted upon by all delegates present. If the request passes, all evidence submitted by the defendant will be entered into the permanent galactic record and made publicly accessible." The vote took 3 hours. Delegates argued, negotiated, and threatened each other in the corridors outside the hall. The council member species tried desperately to build a coalition to defeat the request. But something had changed in the past 6 days. The minor species, who had always been too divided and too frightened to stand together, saw an opportunity they might never have again. When the final vote was counted, the transparency mandate passed by a margin of 12 votes. It was the narrowest possible victory, but it was enough. John Morrison's evidence would become part of the permanent galactic record. Every document he had collected over 40 years would be accessible to anyone who wanted to see it. The secrets that had protected council corruption for centuries were about to become public knowledge. After the vote, John remained at his table, organizing his documents for the next day's session. Most of the delegates had left, but a few lingered, watching him with a mixture of curiosity and respect. Councillor Marin approached him. She was small and old, her scales faded with age, but her eyes were bright with emotion. "Thank you," she said simply. John looked up from his papers. "For what?" "For doing what we could not. For speaking the truth when no one else would." John shook his head. "I just presented documents, Counselor. You were the one who invoked the transparency mandate. Without your request, this evidence would have remained trapped in tribunal records that no one ever reads. But I would never have had the courage without you. Watching you stand alone against all of them, refusing to be intimidated, answering every objection with patience and facts. You showed me that it was possible." John was quiet for a moment. Then he reached into his leather folder and removed an old photograph. It showed a younger John standing beside a cargo ship, surrounded by crates of medical supplies. Beside him stood a Thesari worker with distinctive markings on her scales. "Do you recognize this person?" John asked. Councillor Marin took the photograph with trembling hands. "This is my mother. She died 30 years ago. 40 years ago, I delivered medical supplies to your homeworld during the Thesari plague. The council refused to send help. They said your planet was too unimportant, too far from major trade routes, not worth the investment. I was working for a small human trading company at the time. We rerouted our entire fleet to bring supplies to your people. It wasn't much, but it was everything we had." Marin stared at the photograph, tears forming in her eyes. "Your mother worked at the distribution center where we delivered the supplies. She helped us unload the ships. On the last day before we left, she told me something I never forgot. She said that kindness travels in circles. When you give it freely, it returns to you in ways you cannot predict. She said the Thesari would never forget what humanity did for them." John gently took the photograph back. "I didn't know you were her daughter when you spoke today. I didn't plan any of this. But maybe your mother was right. Maybe kindness really does travel in circles." Councillor Marin wiped her eyes. "What happens now? The evidence will be public, but the council will still try to punish you." "Let them try," John said. "Tomorrow I will finish presenting my documents. Then the tribunal will have to make a choice. They can find me guilty and apply the same standard to everyone else, or they can drop the charges and admit that the whole thing was a farce. Either way, the truth is out. That's all that matters." The 7th day of the tribunal was the last. John presented his final documents, completing the record of 40 years of observation. When he finished, he had documented 4,217 violations of Trade Regulation 749 Alpha by council member species. The financial penalties, if applied equally, would bankrupt several major trading houses and cripple the economies of at least 3 homeworlds. The prosecution had given up objecting days ago. Keseth sat at his table in silence, his confidence shattered, his career effectively over. The other prosecutors stared at their tablets, avoiding eye contact with anyone. When John finally sat down, the hall was silent. Everyone understood what had happened. An old human with no power and no resources had dismantled centuries of corruption using nothing but patience and documentation. Magistrate Varen looked exhausted. The trial had destroyed whatever reputation he once had for impartiality. His rulings had been overturned repeatedly by John's superior knowledge of procedure. His bias had been exposed for everyone to see. "The prosecution may now present closing arguments," Varen said, his voice flat. Keseth rose slowly. He walked to the center platform but did not face the judges. Instead, he faced John Morrison. "When this trial began, I thought I knew what kind of person you were. An old man, powerless and afraid, who would submit to council authority Because he had no choice. I was wrong. He paused, his scales shifting through colors that indicated complex emotions. You are the most dangerous being I have ever faced in 200 years of practice. You carry no weapons. You command no armies. You control no wealth. Yet you have done more damage to this council in 7 days than any military force could do in 7 centuries. He turned to face the judges. The prosecution withdraws its request for penalties against the defendant. We recommend that all charges be dismissed. The hall erupted in noise again. Delegates shouted questions and demands. The minor species representatives cheered openly. The council members sat in stunned silence, unable to process what they were witnessing. Varenne struck his gong for order. When the noise finally subsided, he spoke. The charges against John Morrison are dismissed. This tribunal is concluded. John stood, gathered his documents into his leather folder, and walked out of the Grand Tribunal Hall. He did not look back. He did not celebrate or gloat. He simply walked through the corridors of Velthar Prime toward the spaceport where a ship waited to take him home. Behind him, the galaxy was changing. The evidence in the public record would spark investigations, reforms, and revolutions across hundreds of worlds. The old order that had ruled for centuries was beginning to crumble. Minor species were organizing for the first time in galactic history. Council members were turning on each other, desperate to avoid blame for the corruption John had exposed. None of this surprised John Morrison. He had seen it coming from the moment he opened his leather folder on the first day of the trial. He had planned for this outcome. He had prepared for it. Margaret had prepared for it, decades before she died. As his ship lifted off from Velthar Prime, John looked out the window at the planet shrinking below him. The towers of the capital city glittered in the sunlight. The Grand Tribunal Hall was just a tiny speck of black among the sprawling urban landscape. He thought about Counselor Marin and her mother. He thought about the 800 refugees who died in the blockade 40 years ago. He thought about Margaret, lying in her hospital bed, making him promise to finish what they had started. "I did it," he whispered to no one. "I kept my promise." Then he closed his eyes and slept peacefully for the entire journey home. The months following the tribunal were chaotic across the galaxy. John Morrison returned to his cabin in Montana, but the world he came back to was not the same world he had left. Everything had changed, and everything was still changing. News broadcasts from every corner of the galaxy reported on the aftermath of his testimony. The evidence in the public record had become the foundation for hundreds of investigations. Trading houses that had operated without oversight for centuries were suddenly being examined. Politicians who had built careers on corruption were facing questions they could not answer. The old order was cracking apart. On Earth, John became famous overnight. Journalists camped outside his cabin, trying to get interviews. Politicians wanted him to speak at events and endorse their campaigns. Corporations offered him money to consult on their compliance programs. He refused everything. "I just want to go fishing," he told Director Chen when she visited him 2 weeks after his return. "I did what I needed to do. The rest is not my responsibility." Chen sat on his porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of red and gold. She had aged visibly since they first met. The pressure of the past months had taken a toll on everyone involved. "The Velthari government has fallen," she said. "The evidence you presented showed that their ruling council was directly involved in the corruption. Their own people demanded accountability. There have been protests, riots, and now a complete restructuring of their political system." John nodded but said nothing. "The Brennari and the Cassorians are negotiating new trade agreements. They're trying to distance themselves from the old way of doing things. The Thessary coalition has tripled in size. Minor species that never dared to speak up are now joining together to demand representation." "That's good," John said. "Margaret would be pleased." Chen turned to look at him. "How did she know? How did your wife know 40 years ago that this would happen?" John smiled at the memory. "She didn't know exactly what would happen, but she understood how power works. She spent her whole career studying civilizations that rose and fell. She noticed patterns that others missed." He looked at the mountains his wife had loved so much. Margaret believed that every corrupt system contains the seeds of its own destruction. The same rules that powerful people use to control others can be turned against them. The same laws they enforce selectively can be enforced equally. All it takes is someone willing to pay attention and write things down. But why you? Why did she choose you to do this? Because I was in a position to see things. A logistics coordinator handles thousands of transactions. I had access to records that most people never look at. Margaret saw that opportunity. She gave me the folder on our wedding day and told me to document everything. She said someday it would matter. He paused, his voice softening. I didn't always believe her. There were years when I thought we were wasting our time. Who were we to challenge the Galactic Council? We were nobody, just a logistics coordinator and a history teacher from a minor species on the edge of explored space. But you kept going. Margaret kept going. I just helped. A month later, Kesath arrived on Earth. The former High Arbiter had lost everything. His family's trading house had been seized. His reputation was destroyed. His species looked at him with shame and anger. He had nowhere else to go. John found him sitting outside the general store in the nearest town, wearing common clothes instead of formal robes, looking like any ordinary traveler. The townspeople had no idea who he was or what he had done. High Arbiter, John said, approaching him. I wasn't expecting to see you here. Kesath looked up. His scales had faded to a dull gray, a sign of deep depression in his species. I am no longer High Arbiter. I am nothing now. Would you like to come to my cabin? I can make coffee. Kesath stared at him in disbelief. After everything I did to you, after everything I tried to do to your species, you offer me coffee? You look like you need it. They walked together up the dirt road to John's cabin. Kesath moved slowly, as if the weight of his failures was crushing him physically. When they arrived, John made coffee and poured 2 cups. They sat on the porch looking at the mountains. Why did you do it? Kesath asked finally. You could have accepted my offer. You could have walked away with everything you wanted. Instead, you destroyed us. John considered the question carefully before answering. 40 years ago, I watched council ships blockade a human colony. 800 refugees, including children, starving to death because they could not afford your tariffs. I wrote down what happened. I wrote down who gave the orders. Kesath's scales darkened with shame. I remember that incident. I was a junior arbiter at the time. I helped draft the legal justification for the blockade. I know your name is in my documents. Then why offer me coffee? Why show me kindness after what I did? John took a sip from his cup. Because kindness is not something you earn, it's something you give. My wife taught me that. She said hatred and revenge are easy. They feel satisfying in the moment, but they poison everything they touch. Kindness is harder. It requires strength. But it's the only thing that actually changes the world. Kesath was silent for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. I spent 200 years believing that power was the only thing that mattered. I built my career on exploiting the weak and protecting the strong. I thought that was how civilization worked. I thought there was no other way. There is always another way, John said. Sometimes it takes a long time to find it. Sometimes it takes generations. But it exists. What do I do now? My life is over. Everything I worked for is gone. John looked at him with something that might have been compassion. Your old life is over. That's true. But you're still alive. You still have years ahead of you. You can spend them wallowing in self-pity, or you can spend them trying to fix some of the damage you cause. How? No one will trust me. No one will listen to me. Then don't ask for trust. Earn it. Start small. Help someone without expecting anything in return. Then help someone else. Keep doing it until you become the kind of person you want to be. Kesath stared at him. You really believe that's possible? After everything I've done? I believe people can change. I've seen it happen. I've seen enemies become friends. I've seen oppressors become protectors. The galaxy is full of stories like that, if you know where to look. They sat together until the sun went down and the stars came out. Kesath asked questions about Earth, about humanity, about how humans had survived and thrived despite being a minor species in a hostile galaxy. John answered patiently, sharing stories from his career and from Margaret's research. When Kesath finally left the next morning, something had shifted in his eyes. The despair was still there, but beneath it was something else. A small spark of hope, fragile but real. Thank you, he said as he walked down the dirt road. I don't deserve your kindness, but I am grateful for it. No one deserves kindness, John replied. That's what makes it kindness. 3 months after Kesos's visit, representatives from across the galaxy gathered on a neutral station to discuss reforms to the council system. The conference was the largest diplomatic event in centuries. Species that had never spoken to each other were sitting at the same tables, negotiating the future of galactic civilization. John Morrison was invited to speak at the opening ceremony. He declined. I'm not a politician or a diplomat, he told the organizers. I'm a retired logistics coordinator. My part is done. The rest is up to you. Instead, he sent a written message that was read aloud to the assembled delegates. I am honored by your invitation, but I cannot accept it. The changes happening in the galaxy are not my achievement. They are the result of millions of beings making choices to demand better from their leaders and from themselves. I want to share something my wife once told me. She said that civilizations are not built by heroes. They are built by ordinary people who refuse to accept injustice as normal. Every time someone speaks the truth when it would be easier to stay silent, they make the galaxy a little bit better. Every time someone shows kindness when it would be easier to be cruel, they plant a seed that may grow into something wonderful. I am just a man who wrote things down. The real work of building a better civilization belongs to all of you. I trust you to do it well. The message was received with a standing ovation that lasted several minutes. Delegates who had spent their careers in conflict embraced each other. Minor species representatives wept openly. Even some former council members nodded in respect. The reforms that emerged from the conference were not perfect. They were compromises, messy and incomplete. But they were a beginning. For the first time in galactic history, minor species had genuine representation in major decisions. The selective enforcement that had protected the powerful for centuries was officially abolished. New transparency requirements made it impossible to hide the kind of corruption John had exposed. The old order did not collapse overnight. Change never happens that quickly. But the direction was clear. The galaxy was moving towards something better, one small step at a time. And in a cabin in the mountains of Montana, an old man sat on his porch drinking coffee and watching the sunrise. He thought about his wife and the promise he had kept. He thought about all the people across the galaxy who were working to build a better future. He smiled and lifted his cup in a silent toast. We did it, Margaret. We really did it. The mountains stood silent and eternal around him. The birds sang in the pine trees. The world was at peace. For now, that was enough. A year had passed since the tribunal on Velthar Prime. The galaxy continued to change in ways both large and small. The reforms implemented at the Neutral Station Conference were spreading across civilized space, transforming relationships between species that had been frozen in conflict for centuries. John Morrison spent most of that year doing exactly what he had always wanted to do. He fished in the streams near his cabin. He tended his garden. He read books that Margaret had loved and visited the places they had dreamed of seeing together. He was at peace in a way he had not been since her death. His children visited often, bringing his grandchildren to spend weekends in the mountains. The boys, now 9 and 11, had grown tall and curious. They asked their grandfather endless questions about his adventure, wanting to hear every detail of the tribunal. Did you really beat all those aliens by yourself, Grandpa? The older boy asked one evening as they sat around a campfire. John smiled at the question. I didn't beat anyone. I just showed them the truth. The truth did the rest. But weren't you scared? Mom said they were really powerful and they wanted to hurt you. I was scared sometimes, John admitted. But your grandmother taught me that courage isn't about not being scared. It's about doing the right thing even when you are scared. She was the bravest person I ever knew. I wish we could have met her, the younger boy said quietly. John put his arm around his grandson. She would have loved you both very much. And in a way, you did meet her. Every time I tell you her stories, every time I share what she taught me, a little piece of her lives on, that's how people stay with us after they're gone. The Galactic News continued to report on developments connected to Morrison's testimony. The Velthari had completed their political restructuring and were working to rebuild their reputation. Their new government had formally apologized for centuries of exploitation and established reparation programs for affected species. It would take generations to heal the damage, But the process had begun. The Thessari coalition had become a major political force. Counselor Marin was now one of the most respected leaders in the galaxy, known for her wisdom and her commitment to justice. She had spoken to John several times over the past year, updating him on the progress of the reforms and thanking him again for what he had done. "You started a revolution without firing a single shot," she told him during their most recent conversation. "Historians will study what you did for centuries." "I hope they study Margaret more than me," John replied. "She was the one who understood what needed to be done. I just followed her plan." One morning in early autumn, John heard the sound of a vehicle approaching his cabin. He looked up from his garden to see an unfamiliar shuttle descending through the clouds. It was small and sleek, clearly designed for personal transport rather than official business. The shuttle landed in the meadow where the council enforcement vessel had landed a year ago. A single figure emerged and walked toward the cabin. John recognized the distinctive walk before he could see the face clearly. Kesseth had changed. His scales had regained some of their color, and he moved with a purpose that had been absent during his last visit. He wore simple traveling clothes, similar to what John himself might wear. "Mr. Morrison," Kesseth said as he approached, "I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all. Would you like some coffee?" They sat on the porch as they had before, looking at the mountains. The autumn colors were spectacular this year, reds and golds and oranges covering the hillsides. "I wanted you to know what I've been doing since we last spoke," Kesseth said. "After I left your cabin, I traveled to some of the worlds that my family's trading house had exploited. I wanted to see for myself what we had done." He paused, his scales shifting through complex patterns of color. "It was worse than I imagined. Entire communities destroyed. Generations of poverty caused by our greed. Children growing up without hope because we took everything their parents had. That must have been difficult to see." "It was, but it was also necessary. I needed to understand the full weight of my mistakes before I could begin to make amends." Kesseth reached into his traveling bag and removed a small data tablet. "I've spent the past year working with relief organizations on those worlds, building schools, establishing medical clinics, creating economic opportunities for communities that had none. It's not enough to undo the damage, but it's a start." John looked at the tablet, which showed images of construction projects and smiling faces. "I'm glad to hear it. I also testified at the Reform Conference. I told them everything I knew about how the old system worked, how the corruption was maintained, how the powerful protected each other. Some of my former colleagues hate me for it, but others have started to follow my example." "Change often starts with one person willing to go first," John said. Kesseth nodded slowly. "You told me something during my last visit. You said that people can change, that enemies can become friends. I didn't believe you at the time. I thought you were being naive." He turned to face John directly. "I was wrong. I have changed. Not completely, not perfectly, but genuinely. The person I am now would be unrecognizable to the person I was a year ago." John smiled. "I can see that. I came here today to thank you, not for defeating me at the tribunal. Anyone with your evidence could have done that. I came to thank you for the coffee, for the kindness, for treating me like a person instead of a monster. You were never a monster. You were just lost. Perhaps, but you helped me find my way. That kindness you showed me, that compassion for an enemy who deserved none of it, that changed something in me. It showed me that there was another way to live." They talked for several hours, sharing stories and observations about how the galaxy was evolving. Kesseth described the reform movements spreading across Velthari space. John shared letters he had received from beings on dozens of worlds, thanking him for giving them hope. When Kesseth finally stood to leave, he extended his hand in the human gesture of friendship that John had taught him during his previous visit. "I don't know if we will meet again," Kesseth said, "but I want you to know that I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of the kindness you showed me." John shook his hand firmly. "That's all any of us can do. Try to be worthy of the kindness we've received." As Kesseth's shuttle disappeared into the clouds, John sat back down on his porch and thought about everything that had happened. A year ago, he had been a retired logistics coordinator with a folder full of documents and a promise to keep. Now he was someone that historians would study for centuries, but he didn't feel like a historical figure. He felt like the same person he had always been. An ordinary man who had done an extraordinary thing because the woman he loved had shown him how. The next week, a young Velthari arrived at his cabin. She was barely an adult by her species standards, with bright scales and eager eyes. She had traveled across the galaxy to ask John Morrison a single question. "I'm studying history," she explained as they sat on the porch. "I want to understand how you did what you did. How an ordinary person with no power and no resources defeated the most powerful institution in the galaxy." John considered her question carefully. "Do you want the simple answer or the complicated one?" "Both, if you're willing to share them." "The simple answer is patience and documentation. I paid attention to what was happening around me, and I wrote it down. I did this every day for 40 years. When the moment came to use what I had learned, I was ready." The young Velthari nodded, recording his words on her tablet. "The complicated answer is that I didn't defeat anyone. The Council defeated itself. Every corrupt institution eventually does. They create rules to control others, but those same rules can be turned against them. They build systems of power that contain the seeds of their own destruction. All I did was show people what was already there. But why you? Why were you the one who saw it?" John smiled at the memory. "Because of my wife. Margaret was a history teacher who studied how civilizations rise and fall. She noticed patterns that others missed. She understood that truth is the most powerful weapon in the universe, if you're patient enough to use it properly." He looked at the mountains, golden in the afternoon light. "Margaret couldn't be here to see what we accomplished. She died before the tribunal. But everything I did because of her. Because she taught me. Because she believed in me. Because she made me promise to finish what we started together." The young Velthari was quiet for a moment. Then she asked, "If you could give advice to someone like me, someone who wants to make the galaxy better, what would you say?" John thought about the question. He thought about Margaret and their decades of preparation. He thought about Counselor Marin and her mother. He thought about Kesoth and his transformation. He thought about all the ordinary people across the galaxy who were making small choices to demand better from their leaders and from themselves. "Pay attention," he finally said. "Write things down. Be patient. Show kindness, even when it's hard. And never give up on the belief that things can change." He paused and added one more thing. "Also, find someone to love. Someone who sees the world clearly and isn't afraid to tell the truth. Someone who believes in you even when you don't believe in yourself. Hold on to that person. Learn from them. Let them make you better than you could ever be alone." The young Velthari thanked him and departed, carrying his words with her across the galaxy. John watched her shuttle disappear into the sky and felt a deep sense of completion. That evening, he sat by the fireplace with Margaret's photograph in his hands. She smiled at him from across the years, frozen in a moment when they were young and the future seemed infinite. "I kept my promise," he told her. "Everything we worked for came true. The galaxy is changing. The old order is falling. The species we helped are rising up. And I got to come home to our mountains, just like you always wanted." He placed the photograph on the mantel next to the worn leather folder she had given him on their wedding day. "I miss you every day, but I know you're proud of what we did. And I know that wherever you are, you're still teaching, still helping people see the truth, still believing that kindness can change the world." He turned off the lights and went to bed. Outside, the stars shone brightly over the mountains. The galaxy spun slowly through the darkness, carrying billions of beings toward a future that no one could predict. But somewhere on a small blue planet at the edge of explored space, an old man slept peacefully. He had kept his promises. He had told the truth. He had shown kindness to his enemies and trusted that it would matter. And it had mattered, more than anyone could have seen coming.